Ron's looking ready over there. He's ready to party. He's glad that you guys are here to chat with him for a little bit. If you have any questions, we're going to hold those to the end. So once Ron is finished, just put your hand in the air and I will come to you with a microphone. But our first topic of the day is commercial UAS, access, ecosystems, and market evolution. And we are joined by speaker Ron Stearns right up here, the man, the myth, the legend. He is the Business Development Director of Robotics and Unmanned Systems with Velocity Group. We're small but mighty, so let's make him feel really welcome, you guys. Let's please put our hands together for Ron.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for coming by and making the hike over from the plenary session this morning. My name is Ron Stearns. I am the Director of Business Development for Robotics and Unmanned Systems at Velocity Group. We are a full-service design and manufacturing firm, and I was asked to talk today about what we see as the near and midterm future for commercial market development, for aerospace access, and also the ecosystem that is going to increasingly service this marketplace. So essentially a brief history of time here, and if you're having trouble seeing, come on up, please. There's room up in the front rows. What this slide, the takeaway from this slide is actually a very encouraging one when it comes right down to it, because if we look over here in May of 2014, when the FAA started accepting petitions for commercial exemptions under Section 333. That was a big flag to be planted in the ground at that point in time, because for the previous 4 years there really was not a lot of motion at all perceptible within the commercial market space, and so that started basically a cascading of events over about 24 months that has led us to what I see as essentially a Part 107 paradigm, where you can self-certify, start to fly, and actually start to grind in some revenues from this marketplace. So you have a situation in May of 2014 when the FAA announced that it was going to start accepting exemptions, and in June of 2016 the FAA had issued 5,309 of these exemptions. Those exemptions became blanket, they became repeatable, and it became a business model that could be repeated over time in place as long as you stayed within those use parameters. And then with announcements of risk-based certification and the beginnings of some night operations under Section 333, you had Part 107 that was released June 21st of 2016. So if you look at the previous 4 or 5 years up into 2014, there was almost no perceptible movement for these commercial markets. And then in just 2 years you have a situation where you have a self-certification regime where you are in essence enabled to certify your operations, to get certified as a pilot, and to go forth and to create businesses. So one of the questions that we have here as we move this forward is that how will industry accommodate a move to potentially millions worldwide of systems and the UAVs that come with them, and things like the regulatory production and equipage, information flow, C2. So all of these things, when we were lucky enough to moderate the design panel on Monday, a lot of these things came to the fore about what does industry really need to move this forward with regard to the human-machine interface piece. Not so much airworthiness, that's going to be a top-down mandate for type certifications as we move and push up through Part 107 and beyond. But information flow, production, and the equipage pieces are going to be very, very important as we move the commercial market forward, because the capability gaps exist within there, from the performance of the vehicles themselves, their ability to move information, their ability to capture high-resolution imagery and move it through the chain. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. So we're looking at what we call, or what I was asked to put together over time in my past life, from the traditional 5 groups to 6 traditional risk classes. And in essence, over time, I think this one does make more sense, essentially because you're going to have a situation within these risk classes. There's a lot of math behind the risk classes themselves, and it essentially comes down to how much kinetic energy a vehicle in this class can bring to a given event. It also makes a little more sense as you move up the chain into risk class 6, 5, and 4. And so that circle, that red square that I have around there, is I think where we're going to find some of the best commercial opportunities over time, based upon the size of the vehicle itself. So where I really feel the best commercial opportunities will exist over time are vehicles with a max takeoff weight of between about 40 and 400 pounds. That's a loose frame, but I think it's one that holds true because everything comes down to cost per flight hour. And if you look at cost per flight hour within this range here, can't walk too much with the mic, but when you see RQ7 here on the left at about 384 pounds, and you see the venerable RMAX there at about 200 pounds, that's where you start to get some real utility in the vehicle. The vehicle can fly in different atmospheric conditions. It can sustain flight and operations in greater winds. It can handle particulates and dust and precipitation as well. So yes, this is going to have to punch us through Part 107 with regard to max takeoff weights, but all parts of Part 107 are waiverable as I understand it. And as long as you can come with a safety case to FAA, to Wes Ryan and his office, about here are our exemptions, or exceptions, pardon me, to Part 107. Here are the added risks, but here's what we've done to mitigate them within our concept of operations. Then I think you will be able to be at an operational stage within 12 to 18 months of that submission, and maybe to the left of that. And so that's my hope as we move this along. So another thing on cost per flight hour, which is interesting, if you look at that Cessna 172 over here, the cost per flight hour on that is somewhere between $170 and $200 an hour. And so if you're going to have a mapping application in that space and use a UAV, you have to have a really good business case around why am I going to use a UAV rather than a piloted platform like that. And there are a number of business cases and use cases that I've had the privilege to look at over the last several years that say yes, there are programmed mapping needs where that makes sense, and there are also ad hoc and emergency needs where that makes sense, where your ability to pinpoint a problem over a vast geographic range in inclement weather makes a lot of sense from the business case. The opportunity cost is very well understood for a number of those industrial customers. So what we've also seen, if you look at the right side of that, I won't read all of it, but essentially what we've seen over time at Velocity Group is that the technical obsolescence and integration rates are rapid and not slowing down. So the ability to spiral capabilities into an existing vehicle is almost primordial to its success and its amortization over time. And the fact that many of the systems that we see out there are not exactly modular, not exactly open architected, the interfaces aren't really allowing for a great deal of integration, is having a deleterious effect on obsolescence, and it's actually I think having a hindering effect on the number of volume for sales of larger Group 1 and 2 UAVs. So modular and open architected as we move this forward, I think will be a very good thing as those barriers to entry continue to fall. That will be a differentiator in my opinion. So early takeaways from Part 107 that we've seen over time, and I use a lot of this information to inform my team internally with regard to what we've seen and how that will impact how we choose to spend our IRAD and our calories to move this forward. So, you know, we've seen there is a gold rush when you look at the number of operators, even when you just looked at the Section 333 paradigm. 5,300 or so, probably closer to 6,000 of those before Part 107 dropped. So who is winning? So I don't know if you would call them winners, but you're looking at a lot of small businesses, hyper-localized with less than $1 million in revenue over that. So what we want to see move forward are the imagery data, the analytics, and all of those things will continue to drive concepts of operation and the revenues. There is still a big push, and Pathfinder and some other programs getting us to a beyond visual line of sight schematic, which is vital and which will absolutely help the commercial markets as we move them forward. But beyond visual line of sight is not simply over the horizon. In many cases, in industrial use cases, it can be 50 or 60 yards away that you're looking at beyond visual line of sight simply because of occlusion. So that, I think it's an interesting paradigm shift to think about beyond visual line of sight more than just in your management and management and maintenance of long linear structures. I think we talked a little bit about how commercial UAV size, weight, and reliability must evolve and I think grow in order to really unleash the true market potential as we move this forward. So you're looking at greater weight, greater endurance, greater reliability, and perhaps looking at redundancies built into the systems. And as the systems grow in size up into 100 and 200 pounds over time, we're going to have a situation where that redundancy is going to be more and more possible. And you'll also be able to build in things like graceful degradation into your vehicles, so there will be far fewer single point or single string failures within those vehicles themselves. And I do think, you know, if you look at the Kuhn cycle there, I do think we really are on the edge of a wonderfully intellectually violent revolution in this space, to where it will be seen as not a destructive and maybe not even a disruptive force, the UAV itself, but as an additive, as an addition, and as an expansive way to accomplish a number of tasks that we currently accomplish through sending teams out into fields or flying traditional aircraft or using satellite data, but getting to a place where we think of that UAV as an adjunct or simply another tool in the toolbox. And I think that is a very healthy thing, and I think industry is starting to wrap its mind around it. Was able to attend the Drone Advisory Committee outbrief in January. Another one coming up in May. So some of these, the numbers, I think, you know, if you want to add 10 to 15% on top of some of these numbers, you can do so. But I think it's what it really does is illustrate where we are and where we're going. There were 700,000 registrants in year one of the FAA's online drone registry, and that it's a subjective opinions on that as to whether that is adequate or inadequate with regard to the number of registrations. I think the FAA will continue to go forward with what it really wants to see as a culture of essentially a culture of compliance, to where if someone is out of compliance, rather than bringing a hammer down on them saying, hey, you were out of compliance, let us do what we can to bring you back into compliance. And so I think that is a healthy way of thinking about this as we move this forward. There were 42,000 drone registrants registered as commercial users out of that 700,000. So, you know, that ratio, I think, will tend to continue to tilt slightly upward with regard to the commercial piece of it. We had 35,000 applicants for the Part 107 pilot knowledge exam and 17,000 passing it. So there were, which left at a number of about 29,000 remote pilots in the U.S. with 6,000 in process. This was as of late January, so these numbers will have changed a little bit. We'll get some new data coming later this month in May. The commercially important activity, that's my filter that I put on this, and these are some things that I thought were very encouraging that came from the committee with regard to the subcommittees and what they want to move forward. We're looking very hard at operations over people not commercially involved and beyond line of sight operations. The example again there being Pathfinder. And I think we need to get to a place where both of those are continuing to be worked in tandem and worked very hard in order to get to a growing number of commercial use cases to I think, unleash that portion of Part 107 that we can't really access at this point in time. All of those, there are changes to the waiver process and work, again, to enable access beyond Part 107 with more of a risk-based methodology behind it. So if you can bring your risk case and your use case to FAA, even if it punches beyond 107 in a couple of ways, if you can, again, if you can enumerate the risk case or the additional risk factors that you bring to the table beyond Part 107, but also list how you're planning to attenuate them in your concept of operations, I think it'll speed your process through. There are the needs for aggregated commercial data are really acute. There's no real way to aggregate and move those through at this point in time. So the safety case, although it's being built, I don't think there's a great deal of visibility on it. So it's a function of how many flights to how many mishaps right now. There really isn't a whole lot in between that. So that is a bit of a concern to me. But hopefully the subcommittees will find ways to elicit that information from, well, from the DJIs and the dominant group 1 and 2 platforms right now that might hold some of that telemetry and use data. Took a look at the ecosystem that is serving this industry over time. So we looked at about 650 or so organizations that are currently and presently involved in commercial UAS operations or have a stated intent to very quickly move their way in here. And essentially what I did was to take those companies and say, okay, what is their core capability set? And then plug them into essentially a spreadsheet from which you see this here. So the interesting piece here, there's the laser pointer, I think. Yeah, well, kind of. So, but I'll walk not too far from it. But if you look at the left side of this pie chart, more or less, if you look at propulsion, manufacturing, electronics, software, and embedded systems, one of the things that was really enlightening when I put this in front of our design engineers, they said, those are the markets that we've served for a very, very long time. And then if you look at, those are the core competencies that we've seen over a very long time. And if you look at the other side of the puzzle, essentially those are where the customer sets have sat right there. So I do think that this ecosystem, as it continues to grow and evolve, will have a number of entities out there that are able to serve it and serve it well. And it's not, it's the trick, as my engineers have told me, it's in the glue. It's how do you put these systems together? How do you take best of breed systems from electronics, from software, to propulsion, to electro-optical and IR imagers, and how do you make them into a system that has immediate commercial applicability? That has been very, very difficult over time, especially if you're going to do a bespoke system. And so that's a challenge that industry needs to address within the art of the possible. And if you look around the room, the art of the possible is pretty darn good, but if it only sates about 70% of your needs, that might not be enough. So you know, to pound on the table a little bit about custom solutions that are really wedded to a particular use case, I think that's where industry is probably going to need to go. So present conditions and the way ahead, and so here's a number of things that I see that are actually very encouraging to me and encouraging to our business case over here. If you start at the top and you look at what I see as an initial tranche of investments from venture and other capital sources in 3D robotics and Parrot, GoPro, and Unique. Those pains have been very, very real, and I've taken no pleasure in seeing the struggles that those companies have gone through. However, the commercial, the lower consumer grade end of this market is incredibly competitive, very difficult to compete against DJI. And that's just the way, that's simply the way it has gone. But when I look at the next, what I call the next wave of investment that's come into companies like Hespri and Measure and Precision Hawk, I see more patient money that's around a drone as a service model that seems to make sense from a longer perspective, from more of the long game perspective, and embedding with customer sets that have enduring, repeating needs and budgets for imagery and information. And so that's where the service piece has come to fore. I think that's a model that most certainly can work and be repeatable over time. It's just a function of having anchor clients in those key agricultural and industrial markets to belly up to the bar and say, yes, we're going to do this and we're going to do this together. When we look at the consumer to commercial piece of it, What I would really like to see as we move this along is to get our life expectancy of the drone or the UAV in excess of 300 to 500 hours, because I think that's when end users will be more apt to purchase a system if they know they can amortize it over a lifetime, a flight life cycle time of between 400, 500, up to 1,000 hours is what I would love to see. Because I think that has also had a negative effect on the number of purchases of individual drone systems to be carried internally and used by those end users. And then if we look at the third bar there with regard to product and market maturity, we've seen very, very small companies within the first trickle of Part 107. We've seen limited industrial use, and now we've seen drone as a service and proof of commercial concepts that are underway. So that we're proving the technical use case, I think bar none, within a number of these commercial applications and industrial ones. The secret sauce will be in proving the business use case. And does drone as a service really work over time? I believe it certainly can. And will those industrial users, will they continue to be service customers, or will they take that capability in-house? It's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out over time. And then if you look at the market focus, there was a big focus, I think, between 2014 about 2015 and into 16 on the hardware, on the drone itself as that has moved forward. And now I think we're really starting to work the middle of that pipe for the data piece, the software to link it all together, the algorithms to do the detection, the ability to chip off relevant pieces of information to deliver it in a temporal resolution that makes that imagery and information actionable. That's happening, and it's happening pretty quickly. There are a lot of incredibly smart organizations and people working on it. I don't know if it's a concern of mine, but I think as that pipe, as the software piece enables that pipe in the middle to become a lot bigger to allow that information flow, we're going to come back to the drone, to the hardware, to say, now does the drone itself now become an inhibitor or a choke point in that information process? Is that our single point of failure within this entire system? Is it the pilot in the drone that can only fly during certain meteorological conditions? Does it have the endurance that we need? Does it have the life cycle that we need? Does it have all of those things built into it? And so maybe that's 2018 or beyond, but if there is a circle, I think it could most certainly come back to that. Oops. If we look at the evolving business models right here, this is more about showing some companies that about 4 or 5 years ago you really wouldn't have thought of as being entrenched in these markets and creating different types of either evolving or disrupting business models. If you look at companies like Qualcomm and PricewaterhouseCoopers, you look at AECOM, and perhaps Trimble, which in the 90s I knew as basically just a position, I wouldn't say just a positioning company, I don't mean that in the pejorative, but they were essentially a GPS and industrial company. And so if you look at the types of businesses that they're wishing to stand up within and directly adjacent to this commercial UAS market space, it's very interesting. And then you have these truly disruptive models that are very visionary, very much pushing the envelope with regard to technologies, with regard to scaling designs, with regard to the legislative environment. And so on a recent panel at the FAA UAS in Reston, you had Google, Amazon, and Uber and one other sitting on a drone panel. And so you really wouldn't have seen that, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. So it's very interesting the types of interesting 5 minutes, the types of companies that are moving through this. A look at our market gap and commercial opportunity here. I won't spend too much time on it, but I hope that we can look back in 3 or 4 years and take a look at that beautiful Canon digital SLR hanging underneath a drone and say, my God, how hideous that looked. Because I think we're on the verge of some more very elegant solutions from the sensing side that have better size, weight, and power conditions, and will increase the trade space, the trade-off trade space within, especially within the VTOL UAVs. And if you look at the weight penalties with regard to 10 grams on a 10 grams can equal tens of minutes flight time on a Class 2 fixed-wing UAV, and if you scale that up to an 8 or 9 pound camera, that's a real penalty that you're looking at with regard to your concept of operations. The data capture, process, and delivery piece. This is an interesting one because in a past life I looked at a lot of commercial remote sensing imagery and how the aerial imaging companies and the GIS companies used to really work. And so you had you know, your traditional GIS and aerial imaging companies like Wolpert, Sewall, Merrick, and Terra. And so you had the aerial imagery piece and these polygons that would drop right down to your value-added resellers and then deliver information to your end users. Now, where drone imagery is going to fit in that layer is going to be really interesting as we play it forward. You have companies like Wolpert who have partnered with Altavian to do work within remediation for oil and gas. That's been a very interesting one to see. So I think the forward-looking companies within this space are going to continue to find ways to integrate UAVs into their business operations within Part 107 and perhaps beyond. So the infrastructure piece is very interesting. If you start to, and this is when I think from a business case perspective, it started to make sense to me that this wasn't necessarily a one-off zero-sum game opportunity, that if you're serving one, you can't necessarily serve anybody else within that geographic region. And if you look at, there's the electrical transmission infrastructure. I won't read this. We'll have access to these over time. I don't want to cut into our next presenter's time at all here. But when I started to layer these maps of CONUS over one another, I started to see geographic clusters that an entity or a service provider could really serve on a regional basis, to where that $180 to $200 an hour cost per flight hour, maybe you can push up beyond that because you have the ability to serve multiple customers within the same geographic region. And so that was an interesting piece to me, and that's when the business cases started to make sense to me for the commercial UAS industry. And let me see how many more do I got that than that. And so this is basically, if you look at the infrastructure piece from electricity generation in the United States, thank you to the Washington Post for allowing me to attribute this with full honors. But basically I took some of the numbers from this, threw them into a spreadsheet, and then started to pull out some of the relevant information that I thought from a site. Not the site security is a piece of it, but also the surveillance piece, and also the means by which to look for encroachment and subsidence on some of your fixed infrastructure. The interesting piece there is that if you look at the embedded site surveillance and survey, if you look at gas, coal, and nuclear, that's about 84% of our daily electrical output right there. So there is a concentration, I think, that can be met and fed through that whole piece and time there. Our value proposition is essentially one where I think we can enter you at just about any place on this continuum to take you all the way from something like being a manufacturing partner all the way up through a fleet service model where we could offer you a bespoke UAV solution with fixed operating costs and high mission capable rates. And on the last slide, there's a mission statement, social. I didn't give myself the name, but it's Unmanned Ron, so I kind of have to wear it. And so that's what I have today. I'm at time up. I don't want to step on our next presenter, but I will be most certainly here all day, and I can take questions off to the side if we're short on time. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening.
Yes, and Ron will be available right over here by the audio booth if you'd like to chat with him one-on-one. Thank you very much, Ron.